Hi there, this is my introduction to painting with a digital tablet, Wacom tablet to be specific. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the settings. If this is your first time using your tablet or if you're not comfortable using it all the time, you could stand to benefit from setting up your settings here. So I noticed right away I'm using an Intuos. You may be using a bamboo or an older graphite pen, in which case you may not have this function section. In this grip pen, I find I like to change the tip feel closer to firm. This is how hard you need to press on your pen in order for pressure sensitivity to kick in. The functions keys are really cool. They allow you to program these to kind of replace the need for using your keyboard. What I do here is I've programmed in keystrokes for Option Command Z, or on a PC it would be Shift Alt Z for step backwards in Photoshop. I've also set one for delete, for the keystroke for transform, which is Command T. You can configure these to your own uses, but I find that changing these will allow me to not need to touch my keyboard. I'm going to open up Photoshop here. Typically when I'm painting something that I intend on using as a texture on a 3D surface, I'll go with 2048 by 2048 to start. Typically in my uses I end up using 1024 textures for a lot of things, so starting at 2048 gives me extra resolution just in case I find out that I need it. So this first tutorial I'm just going to paint a basic a block, kind of like a stone tablet shape. So I'm going to start off by blocking out the shape with the polygonal lasso tool. I'm not making a perfect rectangle here. I'm making notches and bends and making it just kind of an organic shape rather than just a rectangle or a rounded rectangle. On a new layer, I'll just make a fill here. I'm just going to use kind of a warm gray color around the mid-tone. I'll fill that in. As far as configuring the brush goes, using the Wacom tablet to its fullest potential, it's going to take a minute and give you a quick tour of the settings here. By default, our brush will draw the shape that we draw with it. By default, our brush will just draw lines. This line isn't doing anything interesting. The harder I press with the tablet, nothing changes, right? It's just a line, just using movement data and whether or not I'm clicking or not clicking. If I enable this button here, this allows me to control the opacity with pressure sensitivity. So the lighter I press, the lighter line I get, but then the harder I press, the harder the line is, the darker the line is. This is very, very nice for painting as it allows us to blend colors into each other without having to be constantly adjusting the opacity control. We can adjust it simply by pressing less and more hard. The other pressure sensitive control that we're going to be using is size. So when I have this enabled, the size of my brush will only go up to the maximum size of the brush when I'm pressing hard. When I'm just dragging it around and not pressing very hard, I'll get a very small brush. So this is the line variation. Also worth mentioning, this is drawing 101 stuff, but we'd like to draw with our shoulder and with our whole arm to get nice, big Bezier curves, nice strokes, nice fluid movements, as opposed to drawing with our wrist or drawing with our hand or fingers, where we get lots of wobbly lines. We don't like this. No bad wobbly line. We like drawing with our whole arm, getting broad strokes. Alright, let's move on. Just going to delete this layer. I'm going to be using a hard brush for most of this exercise. Working with a hard brush tends to give us a bit more of a painterly feel. Working with brushes that are too soft end up being very, very imprecise, and it can look like a beginner work with too much soft brush going on. Not to say soft brushes are always bad, just say, you know, if you're just starting out, avoid them. That way you're making more deliberate choices. So I'm going to draw just an outline to this shape first, using 100% opacity, varying my opacity, but not varying my size. I'm also not going to paint the outline here with black. I'm actually going to paint it with a near black version of the fill color. We like to avoid painting with black whenever possible, since black in textures doesn't really accept any kind of shadows. It just washes out to pitch black too quickly. I'm being a little bit chicken scratchy with these lines here. That's because I'm going to go over them again later. And frankly, I'm okay with these having a bit more texture to them. If I wanted to get a perfectly smooth, beautiful Bezier curve line going around here, I could draw it. It would take a lot longer. I'd probably prefer to use something like the pen tool to do that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start shading. This little button here, Lock Transparency, allows us to always draw within the lines despite our best effort to draw outside the lines. So here's my example. Once it's off, I can draw anywhere. But when it's on, I can only draw on top of pixels that have already been drawn. So reduce my opacity because now I'm creating some shading. Now I'm doing some more painterly things, and I'll increase my size a little bit. I'm right-clicking on the canvas to bring up the brush browser here. I know a lot of people, when they just start using Photoshop, they'll click up here all the time, or they'll have the brush browser open. You don't really need this browser open unless you're working with custom brushes, or you're a real power user and you really like having the extra control over them. I would say for the most part, right-click on your canvas, very quick access to this tool. So very lightly, I'm going to start painting some shadows on the bottom here. Being humans who stand on Earth upright and where the sun usually is in the sky above us, we tend to expect shadows on the bottom side of things and highlights on the top. So I'm going to find any angle that looks like it's pointing a little bit downwards and give a little bit of shadow to it. When I'm painting the shadow, I'm not painting straight lines, I'm painting curves that echo the outline, echo the silhouette where I'm painting it. I'm also curving it back in to the area next to it. Remember, what we're trying to accomplish here with the painting is we're trying to reinforce the fact that this is a 3D shape. We're always fighting against things being flat in digital art because things are so often very flat. So a little bit of shadows been painted in here. What you're probably saying at this point is, Ryan, I should have used a soft brush because I can see where you've made strokes here. Well, we can blend that in. We're not done yet. In order to blend this together, I'm going to make a selection just by holding the Option key or the Alt key on a Windows machine and picking a color that's halfway in between what I started painting with, which is the line color, and what I'm painting towards, which is the fill color. And having a selection that's halfway, that's closer, will allow us to now blend more as we paint. We can do this as many times as we want to get a smoother and smoother image. So now I'm picking a lighter color that's probably about 5% or 10% of the way in to the fill color. And now we're really seeing it kind of blend in and get soft. The advantage here to using a hard edge is that we're actually getting a very nice texture in here as opposed to just blurry soft brush stuff. I'm going to go back and blend in some of the darkest areas now too. Why not? We can control how sharp the drop-off looks like it is in one corner, or how rounded it looks like, by changing the length of the gradient. So here we can see, I can extend this even further for for illustration purposes here, make a very, very long gradient, right? That comes way, way, way in, pretty far into the fill color. And it looks like this is very soft, right? This is a very, very rounded edge. Perhaps this stone has seen a lot of erosion, or perhaps it was round in the first place. But if I grab the fill color and start painting towards the edge and leave a very, very short gradient, well, now it looks like a pretty steep drop off here, right? It's looking more like a planar drop off, like it's less of a smooth angle here. Maybe it's even coming towards us a little bit. We can use these kinds of tricks to define the shape even further. For example, here I'm going to say, this is a quicker drop off. This is more of an edge. This isn't a softer, rounder part. So I'm going to give less room for this gradient that I paint. Same with here, right? Less room for the gradient means a quicker drop off. Very seldom will I actually open up the palette and pick new colors. As I start blending just a little bit, all the in-between colors I need are already here on the canvas. All I need to do is quickly press Alt or Option, pick that color, and start painting with it. It's a very, very quick workflow. It reduces the risk of having poor color choices or going off palette or just taking a lot of time to pick a new color. Next up are the highlights. I'll just throw some highlights on the up-facing angles here. This is something I will use the palette for. Instead of going closer to just white, instead of making it just plain brighter, I'm actually going to shift the hue towards yellow. Make it brighter and make it a little bit more yellow, just to warm it up, right? We always like to have warm light and cold shadows. I might go in and add some blue to the shadows later too. So now I've got some yellow. I do a big coat first, so I'll increase my brush size, decrease my opacity a little bit, and just start laying on some highlights up here. Remember, we don't just have to paint on edges, right? We don't just paint on the silhouette on the outside. We can make up details in the middle of this rock and paint them in. So perhaps the middle of this rock is bumping out. Maybe it goes back in. Maybe it's just a lump on the surface of the rock. We can define this all with shadow. And again, after I've laid down some basic colors here, I can go and blend them by picking in the samples of where it blended together due to the low opacity. And I can hide the harsh brush strokes and replace them with just some nice textured shading. As you do this more, you'll get more comfortable with where shadows and where highlights occur. That's just a lot of the practice here. This isn't something that a tutorial can tell you very quickly. It's something you've got to develop on your own. I'll paint a little bit of white onto this yellow highlight here, just to show where light is catching. Bit of a light bloom kind of thing happening here. Making sure that I use the varying opacity to kind of blur these out on the sides, let them be brightest in the middle where the light collects. Gives a nice kind of gloss to it. Painting more and more detail like this, especially with the hard brush, especially with the smaller brush, is going to make our object look a lot more specular. We'll give a good shine to the surface. Going to add some of those blue shadows I was talking about earlier. Going to make them subtle, right? Just a little bit closer to blue than it already was. And just gloss over. This is a really portable painting technique. This is very simple what I'm doing here, but the act of laying down a fill color, painting in some shadows, blending them together, painting in some highlights, blending them together, then throwing in a few specular highlights. It's a process you can apply to just about anything. We can also paint in some surface detail here. Instead of defining the overall shape, I can make kind of a couple of C shapes to make the appearance of holes. If I grab our line color here, make a C shape pointing downwards, a highlight color pointing upwards. You can see it creates the effect of a hole in the surface. I can do the opposite too, do a light color for the top, dark color for the bottom. Remember, it's light direction that's controlling all this, right? And that's going to create something that looks like it's bumping outwards. This gives a much more organic, handmade feel than the bevel and emboss tool would. Even though the bevel and emboss tool would be a very quick way of doing this, this is a lot more character to it. We can also blend it together to get complexity that we can't get with those other tools. You can even grab a highlight color and really punch up the detail here. Make it catch the light in some very interesting ways. Oftentimes, if I'm using a lot of the fill color, if a lot of the fill color is left over that's just solid, or if I just think the surface doesn't quite have enough texture on its own, I'll do this trick. Do filter, add noise. I'll add just a little bit of noise, and then I'll blur it just slightly. A lot of people get carried away with this, but I think if you just do a little bit, you can totally get away with it. So it's not completely disturbing the image, it's not completely transforming it, it's just making these areas of solid color more interesting. It's breaking up the surface, right? I can always go back in and I can clean up this messy silhouette that I've made. We could even completely paint it over and say, you know what, no outline, we're just going to use light and shadow. That's completely, if you want to do that, go ahead. And there you go, stone tablet.